Okay, next, Professor Joanne Miller will offer a tribute to Jerry. I'd never met her prior to today, but I was familiar with her work. I'd studied speech perception with Pat Kuhl at the University of Washington, and we read seminal studies by Professor Pat Kuhl and by Miller and Imus and Miller and Liberman. And little did I know that she had graduated from here too. Pat Kuhl was also a graduate. So these studies that I was reading back then were looking at the issue of whether speech was special. And what I've learned by knowing that all these people graduated from here is there was something really special going on at the University of Minnesota to educate all of these people who've become leading scholars world-renowned scholars in speech perception. So that includes Joanne Miller, Pat Kuhl, Arlene Carney. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me here today to help honor Jerry. It's really a great privilege. Among Jerry's many, many accomplishments was his great success in mentoring students, both undergraduate students and graduate students. He was always a model of sharp intelligence, deep integrity, warm humor, wisdom, and graciousness. And I was very fortunate to be one of his advisees. And what I'd like to do today is just reminisce a bit, give you basically a case study, tell you how I came to know Jerry and how he came to play such an important part in my life. So, how did I meet Jerry? Well, I actually grew up in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. I actually grew up in the North Minneapolis that he writes about so eloquently in his book, You Should Have Been There. I did. I moved to the suburbs when I was in junior high school. And when it became time to decide where to go to college, there was no issue. I was going to the university. And there was no ambiguity about which university I meant. In those days, everybody in my high school almost went to the University of Minnesota. Very few people went elsewhere. I didn't even apply anywhere else. And now that's absolutely amazing to me. When I first got to the university, I didn't know what I was going to major in. I just wasn't sure. But, and this is true, one of my sorority sisters was majoring in speech pathology, and she was talking about it. And I thought, well, that sounded fairly interesting, so maybe I should give that a try. So I started taking courses in the curriculum, and I thought that was fairly interesting. But then I took a course from Jerry, and I was absolutely hooked. I started taking more and more courses, and I started really just hanging out in the department and participating in any experiments that was running at that time. And then, and you've heard about this today already, then Jerry and Dick Martin got a grant to study disfluencies in adults. So I was here way back then. This was the 60s. I was part of that. And they were looking for an undergraduate research assistant. So I eagerly applied for the position, and I was delighted to be accepted. So I became their research assistant on the project. And from that time on, during the rest of my undergraduate studies, I worked in the lab with Jerry primarily, but also with Dick. And during that time, I learned a huge amount. I learned about how to think about a project, a problem critically. I learned about how to design and run an experiment. I learned about how to analyze data. I learned about how to interpret data, to think about data, and how to start writing. And even though I was just an undergraduate, I was really part of the research team. They really included me in everything. And I was really valued. My opinion was really valued at that time. And that part of that project actually led to my very first publication with Jerry and also with Pat Brown in 1969. And just having that as my first publication is really very, very important to me. And it's just really nice to look back. So when I was a senior, I had to decide what to do next. And this was actually a fairly easy decision for me. I decided I wanted to stay at the university, enroll in a master's program, and study to become a speech pathologist. So I was accepted into the program. I was very happy about that. I spent a year taking coursework, doing research. Jerry was again my advisor for my master's project, and doing clinical work. And I graduated with a master's. And then I actually stayed on another year working in the university speech clinic. And at the end of that, I was able to take the requisite exam and become certified as a speech pathologist. So now I had achieved my goal of becoming certified as a speech pathologist, and it was time to move on and actually get a job. But I decided that's not really what I wanted to do. Instead, I really wanted to do research. I had really caught the research bug from Jerry. And I decided what I really wanted to do was get a PhD and become a professor. Jerry had provided a great role model, and I wanted to see if I could just a little bit follow in his footsteps. So the question at that point was, where should I get my degree? And this time I thought about it fairly hard, but I thought, you know, what I really, really want to do is stay here in the program, work with Jerry as my advisor. So I applied here. I was delighted to be accepted, and so I stayed here to get my PhD. So I started the doctoral program, and at this point, Jerry's influence began to play a role in an even more major way. Those years, and now it was the early 70s, were very heady years at the University of Minnesota, especially in cognitive psychology and developmental psychology and in speech science. You just heard about the number of people from the programs that went on to do really good work. And a hallmark of those times was the very extensive collaboration across departments. And this included the Speech Language Hearing Sciences Department, which had a different name back then, the Institute of Child Development with Herb Pick as one of the major faculty players, the Department of Psychology and the Center for Research in Human Learning with Jim Jenkins as one of the major players. All of those people really worked together, and I worked with all of them, especially Jim Jenkins, who was my unofficial or second advisor, and with all the students from the different departments. And this was all with Jerry's blessing. He was very inclusive always, and really liked the idea of working with so many people across disciplines. And I have to say that he was really ahead of his time, because these days, cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, collaborative work is much more the norm, but it really wasn't then. So it was really part of his vision that allowed all this to happen. For my dissertation research, I wanted to study speech perception in infants. Peter Imus at Brown University had just published a seminal paper showing that young infants, as young as 1 month of age, process speech in a highly sophisticated manner. I was intrigued. This work was really interdisciplinary and involved speech science, cognitive psychology, linguistics, developmental psychology, and I really wanted to take part of that. But there was a problem. And the problem was that there wasn't a speech lab at Minnesota to study infant speech perception. But Jerry said that if I were willing to try to put together a team to build a lab, he would fully support it. So I took him up on the challenge, and with his full support and guidance, we actually built a lab at Minnesota to study infant speech perception. And again, it was very collaborative. Many people were involved. Herb Pick provided space for the lab in the Institute of Child Development. Jim Jenkins provided grant support from funding he had from NIH in the form of computer equipment, a research assistant, and a computer programmer. We all worked together. Along the way, there were many setbacks, including some serious setbacks, and that's another story for another time. Arlene knows about those setbacks. But Jerry was always optimistic that we would be able to move forward, and he was right, because we were able to build the baby lab, and I was able to complete a dissertation in infant speech perception. To digress a bit, while all this was going on, and throughout my entire graduate years, I became friendly with the entire Seigel family, with Eileen and with Karen and David and Josh, and I spent many wonderful hours in their home. I even babysat for a weekend when Eileen and Jerry went east for a weekend. I just remember with such fondness the warmth of the family And Eileen, wherever you are, I want to just personally thank you for your graciousness and warmth and kindness all those years ago. It was really a wonderful part of my life. Back to academics. While I was building the baby lab and during my dissertation research, I started thinking of what I wanted to do next. And at this point, I had been to national conferences, I had met graduate students and faculty from all over. It was finally time to leave Minnesota and to go on and pursue my career elsewhere. My first choice was to do a postdoctoral fellowship with Peter Imus at Brown. I really wanted to continue the infant work with the leading expert in the field, and at that point, he was the leading expert in the field. To do this, I needed funding. And I learned about a National Institutes of Health postdoctoral fellowship program, and I arranged for Peter Imus to sponsor me. So if I were to get that fellowship, I would have funding in hand, and I could go east and do the fellowship with Peter. I was very excited about this possibility until a notice from the government came out, and I don't know why. Maybe it was a government shutdown way back then, some imminent problem with Congress or whatever. But they had decided not to accept any postdoctoral proposals for that round of funding. They didn't have any money. So this, of course, was very disappointing. I was trying to figure out a plan B. Jerry was working with me. We were trying to figure out what I might do next. And then I heard that the government had changed its mind. There was funding available. They were going to fund a round of postdocs. Okay, nothing changes, right? They were going to fund a round of postdocs, but they decided not to change the deadline. So the postdoc proposal was due in a couple of weeks. Jerry came to the rescue. He put aside other work that he was doing, and he and Eileen invited me to their home. It might have been Christmas vacation. I have a vague recollection. And as I wrote drafts of the proposal, Jerry wrote comments, and I revised. And given Jerry's wonderful skill as a writer, of course his comments were always right on. So I finished the proposal, I submitted it, and to my absolute delight, it was funded. So after obtaining my PhD at the university, I went east with my postdoc fellowship at hand. I did a postdoc with Peter Imus for 2 years, and that really launched my career. Over all of these years since, I have felt deeply indebted to Jerry for taking me under his wing, providing support and encouragement, and for being a marvelous role model. I think we all know that Jerry is a very, very special person. He's touched many lives, and I will always be grateful that mine was one of them. Thank you.
Okay, at this time, if there's someone else that would like to give a tribute to Jerry, please come up. If you can, try to limit it to about 5 minutes.
I guess what I want to do is basically reinforce what Joanne was saying, and that Jerry's a great teacher, a wonderful storyteller, warm, thoughtful, but he believed in the contribution to education of students that what he was teaching was critical thinking. He wasn't transmitting information. He was teaching you how to think. He was teaching how to evaluate things. And he believed that was an important part, even if what your intention was a clinical degree. People come along and they say, now what will you be able to do with this degree? Or where are you going to find a job with this degree? And what Jerry would say in terms of what you're going to be able to do with this degree is think. And when it comes right down to it, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you end up in a clinic and doing clinical work. It doesn't matter if you end up in an academic work. Or like one of our graduates actually was running a business. You still have to think. You still have to analyze. You still have to be thoughtful and not jump to conclusions. I think some of that characteristic of Jerry, probably grew out of his experience coming to Minnesota. He came to Minnesota with research experience in other places, but what Minnesota promised was some freedom to do research, and they wanted, there wasn't, this department was a piece of the speech department, a division of the speech department, and also an arm of the Office of the Dean of Students. So people in the department would evaluate the hearing of incoming students, or they would, they had their courses in the speech department, but there wasn't a research program. And Jerry and Dick Martin were the seeds of the research program that exists today. They were the people that developed that. And as they separated from the speech department and the Office of the Dean of Students, and of course that's how they came, that's part of how this department came to have 7 different names. Every time we change somehow, we change the name. They pulled students along with them. And when they looked at new faculty, they looked at new faculty that were, had good research potential, had good research experience, and they included students. And as Joanne said, both she and I were participating in some of that. And he'd just take, if students wanted to come and find out about research, he'd take them in his lab, teach him how to do whatever it was he was doing, and taught him how to think. We'd have informal seminars in his office just looking at the data that came from some of those studies. So I think that his major contribution was teaching students to think. He was a good teacher. He taught students to pursue knowledge, to ask questions, to look at problems systematically. The academic world lost a champion, but he lives on in the spirit of his students and his colleagues.
Just a couple of very extemporaneous and impromptu comments. Ha, ha, ha. I'm Carlin Moeller, and Jerry was teacher, mentor, colleague, and friend to me. And I'm very mindful. It's nice to hear Joni and Pat talk about the early days, too. But I'm very mindful about my first contact with Jerry Seigel. I was taking a course in the Department of Speech and Theater Arts over in Falwell Hall in about 1962 from George Shapiro. Now, I had taken a couple of courses from him and others in that department. At the time, I really needed to make a decision about what I would declare as my undergraduate major. So I asked Dr. Shapiro about speech science, pathology, and audiology, SSPA. Sounded interesting. And at that time was a division of the department. Well, he said, go over to Shevlin Hall and talk with Clark Starr and or Jerry Seigel. They will help you out. So over I went, without thinking to make an appointment. Just kind of stopped by. Well, Dr. Starr was not in that day, but I was given the office number of Dr. Seigel on the 2nd floor, west side of the building. His door was open. He was sitting back in his reclining armchair, big feet and black wingtip shoes up on the desk, and he was conversing amicably with someone, boisterous laughter galore, which, play it forward, became one of his most memorable qualities. I stood within view, and seeing me, he asked if he could help with something. I shared that I wanted to explore SSPA as a major. Cordial as he was, he said it would be best to discuss that with their clinic director, Dr. Starr, so that is what I did. And now I had met 2 nice faculty members in that division, hardly statistically significant with that small n, but good enough for me. So my decision was made to declare that speech science, pathology, and audiology was going to be my major. And that was well over 50 years ago. But it was all those years in between that endeared me to Jerry so much. I had the distinct pleasure of experiencing Jerry as a teacher, superb teacher. I don't believe Jerry particularly liked instructing with the talking head approach, as much as he enjoyed engaging students in discussion. He was reasoned, logical, and thoughtful, and always encouraged us to ask, what do we know for sure, and how do we know it? And most importantly, what methods are required to discover what we do not know? He wasn't so much focused on facts and superficial knowledge. He loved developing in his students curiosity, forming relevant questions, you've heard about that, and applying good science to questions that could be answered by science. And we had some good conversations about that. Jerry gave his students important tools for successful academic and clinical careers and for life. His research and discovery efforts in fluency with Dick Martin, Sam Harrelson, and Roger Ingham, and early speech and language acquisition with Pat Brown made significant contributions to our knowledge base. Now, an interesting intersection here for me and my wife Sue and daughter Cara. You see, back in 1971, Jerry and Pat wished to document the very early speech and language development of a, quote, normal, unquote, child from 5 months to 20 months of age. Now, our daughter Cara was 5 months of age in the fall of 1971, and very interesting. And after a highly rigorous subject selection process, she was selected. Sue brought Cara into Shevlin Hall at regular intervals to videotape, Betamax, of course, the expected robust, at least normal, speech and language emergence. Frankly, what they observed was, for the most part, virtual silence over that 15-month span. Pat, you remember it well. I distinctly remember a graduate assistant saying at Cara's dismissal, or perhaps completion of the project, that she thought the Cara's speech and language was, quote, ready to blossom. Well, I'm happy to report that blossom she did. Cara is now 44 years old, speaking very well, and the graduate assistant was Pat Cool. Jerry was not my advisor, nor did our interests focus on similar speech and language areas, but an important mentor he was, always supportive of me as a graduate student and faculty colleague, to offer thoughtful advice and opinion, to share perspective, the big picture, to teach me about handball and how to beat him occasionally in handball underneath the old Memorial football stadium. And since his retirement over 15 years ago, Jerry has been a cherished friend, reminiscing with robust laughter about the past and the good times. Recent summertime lunches in Stillwater with our mutual friends and colleagues, Ralph Shelton and Pat Brown. Get-togethers at Jerry and Eileen's home on Gladstone Avenue and in Edina. Jerry was always very interested and concerned about my personal life, made so apparent over the last year for me and Sue following our automobile accident. We spoke shortly before he died. Clearly, Jerry has made us and our department and our profession proud of his accomplishments inside and outside these hallowed halls of Shevlin. Important contributions to our professional organizations, creator of the Student Initiative Fund of the department, honors of the association bestowed by ASHA, Outstanding Lifetime Achievement Award bestowed by Misha, musician and author of memories for all of us to enjoy, and certainly most importantly, beloved husband, father, and grandfather. Indeed, our world has lost a huge intellect, influence, and friend. Gerald Morton Seigel, life so well and abundantly lived.
Hello, I'm Cynthia Johnson, and I was Jerry's doc student from the mid to the late 1970s. When I came, I heard that Joanne Miller had been his doc student, and you were a hard act to follow. I first met Jerry up on the second floor in that west office that you were talking about, and he did have his big feet up on the desk, and I noticed that he was wearing lime green socks, and I knew that we were going to be friends, and this was going to be great. He was such a blessing in my life and always so upbeat, always smiling. He allowed me to study children's language disorders, even though he very much wanted me to do auditory feedback work. And I had worked in the auditory feedback lab with Herb Pick and Jerry, and we had published some articles together, and I worked in Pat Brown's lab, and I worked in Chuck Speak's lab, and Jerry's always so supportive of me having a very interdisciplinary, eclectic education. He helped me write my child language dissertation, and I had taken coursework in linguistics, and I studied perfective aspect and grammatical development. Every draft I would give him of my dissertation, he would just smile, and I said, "Did you like it?" And he said, "Well, I still don't understand it." And he would say, and I'd say, "Okay, I'll try again." I was so dead serious and in those days and so sincere. He was always pulling my leg, and I would get it about 2 minutes after he had done it. And I would think, is he teasing? He's teasing. He's teasing. So I think he got a kick out of me because I was so sincere, and I sure got a kick out of him. And I appreciate his even temper and his good nature and his broad thinking and his beautiful writing skills. And I think I learned to write from a master. The first manuscript we submitted came back, and I had my Midwestern conversational English, and the reviewer said, "This paper was so full of grammatical and spelling errors," and I was so mortified, and Jerry just threw back his head and laughed, and he said, "We could take care of that." And ever since, I've always been very careful with grammar and spelling when I submit something. But I didn't get to see him so much through the last 30 years. I went to ASHA every year, the ASHA convention, and Jerry didn't always come, although I did make connections with him at the ASHA convention where he got honors of the association. And Eileen and Jerry came down to visit me in Champaign-Urbana. That was a wonderful visit. And I just always thought there would be Jerry. I was so stunned at the last ASHA convention when they said we had lost him. So, I still hear his laugh in my mind. I can hear his big, hearty laugh. And I'll always feel like he made such a big contribution to my career as a professor. So, thank you.
I'd like to end these tributes to Jerry by reading a letter from one of his former students. I sent out invitations to a lot of people that he was the advisor for, and this person who lives on the East Coast wished she could have attended. But she sent this letter, and when I read it, I was so moved by it, I thought I would share it with you too. Dr. Seigel was my graduate advisor from 1968 to 1972. I had been awarded a fellowship to pursue a doctorate, but vacated it with an incomplete MA to get married in 1969. Dr. Seigel graciously allowed me to take an incomplete in a seminar, write my master's thesis off campus, and even take my comprehensive exams under the supervision of a colleague in Buffalo where I was living at the time. He even met me at the ASHA convention in New York City to guide me through the writing of my thesis. I sent him various drafts of my thesis, and this wasn't done by email. You had to send it in an envelope back then. And he promptly wrote me back. One of the letters that accompanied his comments that I especially remember included his great joy at the celebration of the first Earth Day in 1970. All the years that I've been working in our field, I have been deeply grateful, not only for Dr. Seigel's professional guidance, but his great humanity. He was an exceptional leader and is truly missed by all who had the privilege of knowing him. Thank you for the opportunity to extend my good wishes to everyone at this important event. Sincerely, Tawn Reynolds Feeney. So thank you, everyone. That includes this event. I really enjoyed giving this tribute to Jerry. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.